Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Siouxland Garden Show. We're so excited for another session today on this beautiful Friday. My name is Caitlin Brinkhoff. I'm with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach in Woodbury County. And I have Carol Larvik with Nebraska Extension, Dakota County with me today. So we're going to get started with our little welcome PowerPoint. So really quick, I want to encourage everyone to join us in the comments. Let us know where you're joining us from and if you're a Master Gardener. If you're on Facebook Live, you can jump in the comments there. If you guys are watching on the website, feel free to open that up into a browser and comment through YouTube if you'd like. If you don't have a YouTube account, feel free to jump over into Facebook as well. This is also a spot where you can ask any questions throughout the presentation, so feel free to toss those into the chat as they come up. Just a reminder, we have 2 more weeks of the Siouxland Garden Show coming up. So next week, we're going to learn a little bit about monarch butterflies and the biology and how to help them, as well as wildlife in the landscape. So make sure to check out the remaining sessions on the Siouxland Garden Show website page, and then also on the Facebook page as well. And of course, a big thank you to the Siouxland Garden Show committee that helps put together these awesome shows. So back in September, we had to make the tough decision to stay virtual for 2021. And so we got this all planned out this year, and we're able to offer still 12 sessions for everyone. Back in 2020, we had about 2 weeks to move virtual from our in-person show. And so we're excited that we're still able to have all that continuing education for folks. This is a collaborative effort with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach in Woodbury County with Nebraska Extension in Dakota County. So a big thank you to Carrie King, Carol Larvik, Molly Hewitt, myself, Caitlin Brinkhoff, Kevin Potabom, Emily Yockey, and the bottom 3 Master Gardeners. We have Rex Towns, Randy Burnite, and Diana Kincaid. So we've worked hard putting these sessions together and working hard at planning our 2022 show. So we want to make sure everyone saves the date for the 2022 show. We're looking to be back in person for Friday, April 2nd and Saturday, April 3rd at the Marriott Center in South Sioux City, Nebraska. This is 2 days where you guys can come out and learn, shop, and grow. We'll have a winter's farmers market, educational sessions, children's play area, advice from Master Gardeners, and so much more. So it's $5 each day to get in. And we'd love to have you guys out. I know this is reaching a ton of people that haven't heard of the Siouxland Garden Show before, so we'd love for you guys to take a trip out to see us over that weekend. And a big thank you to our volunteers and vendors that help us put on the Siouxland Garden Show every year. Our in-person show wouldn't be possible without the over 70 volunteers, Master Gardener volunteers that come out and help us put on the show. So we miss everyone, looking forward to 2022. And of course, our over 40 vendors that come out and provide all kinds of continuing education for folks. And another thank you to all of our sponsors for the Siouxland Garden Show. Always check up the top left corner to find out the sponsor for the session today. If you want to learn anything else about these sponsors, you can check out our website. Feel free to go down and hover over their logo. It'll take you to their website so you can learn a little bit more about them. All right, and today we're going to be learning a little bit about container vegetable gardening. So I'm going to go ahead and get Cindy up onto the screen here. And I'm going to switch over to your PowerPoint really quick.
Thank you. Well, Cindy, I hear that the people in Iowa are just as excited about gardening and starting gardening this year as the people in Nebraska. Would you say that is true?
That is true. I think it's this is one of the benefits of the pandemic is more people are really having time at home. They're very interested in gardening, and that trend in trying to grow more plants at home, indoors and outdoors, seems to be carrying through all across the U.S., not just in Nebraska or Iowa.
Yeah, all generations.
All generations too, which is also very good. So my undergraduate students are very into gardening, just like a lot of master gardeners, just like a lot of new homeowners and small families. So, yes.
Awesome. Well, we're excited to hear a little bit more about container vegetable gardening. And so Carol and I will go ahead and jump off. And Cindy, the stage is all yours.
Great. Thank you so much for having me at the virtual Siouxland Garden Show. I think this has been a lot of fun. And it's great because I can do this presentation from my parents' greenhouse in Louisiana, which is kind of fun to think about, though it's much warmer here right now than it is there. And in this greenhouse, it's getting a little hot. So we're going to talk a little bit about container vegetable gardening. First, I'll tell you a little bit about me. I'm an associate professor in horticulture at Iowa State University. I teach several classes, and one of my favorite classes is called Home Horticulture, where we talk about all different aspects of horticulture, including vegetables. And with my undergraduate students, one of their favorite topics is container vegetable gardening. That's because they usually don't have a big space. They have smaller spaces that they're trying to grow some of their own food, and containers work well for them. So next slide. So here's some of the things. I am an instructor, so I have to talk about learning objectives. Here's some of the things that I want us to get accomplished today in our 45 minutes together, is that you know that growing vegetables in containers is a unique opportunity that anyone can do. We'll talk about a few common vegetables that are grown in containers or easy to grow in containers. And then maybe we can discuss some tips or tricks on how to make this more successful, growing vegetables in containers. Next slide. So I usually ask people what are some of the benefits of growing vegetables in containers, but I'm going to save this one for the next slide, if we can go to, and just tell you some of the benefits that we find with growing vegetables in containers. So you know that my undergraduate students like it because they have smaller spaces, patios, decks. They can grow vegetables in those kinds of situations. It's also really efficient growing vegetables in containers because you're not using a large space. You're not planning for rows. The container vegetable gardening, the plant itself is using the entire container, so it's very space efficient. Containers for vegetables is also a great idea as a way to rotate crops. So if you have an outdoor space, but it's not big enough to have, 2 years off or 3 years off for tomatoes and potatoes, you can maybe 1 year have those, or 2 years have those in containers so that you can have that full effect or benefit from crop rotation. Containers are also pretty easy to maintain. We usually have them close to the house. They do require some different maintenance than maybe growing outdoors in a typical garden in the ground, but they tend to be very highly productive and still fairly easy to grow. Next slide. Before we begin, there's a few things that you need to consider, just like you would be growing plants in the ground or growing vegetables in the ground. We've got to talk a little bit about the site. We've got to talk a little bit about what kind of containers you're going to use. We need to mention different crops and how you select different crops. And then we need to talk about some of those unique maintenance tips or maintenance requirements specific to container gardening. Next slide. So site selection is probably the most important. And this trips up some of my undergraduate students because I tell them that if we're growing vegetables, whether it's in the garden or in the landscape or in containers, it's really important to select the right site. And almost all vegetables insist on full sun and good, well-drained soils. So if you don't have at least 4 to 6 hours of direct sunlight a day or more, most vegetables are not going to perform well for you. So make sure you've got the sunniest site possible. We use well-drained soils in containers. And then also make sure you have access to water so it's convenient for you to go out there and water them. Most container vegetable gardens do require more water than if they were planted in the ground. So you need to have that frequent access to water, which usually means it's closer to the house. This is a great benefit because when you're ready to harvest, these containers are pretty close to the house and makes harvesting easier as well. Next slide. When we think about container selection, I tell my students and my master gardeners that you can really pick almost anything. So as long as you're starting out with a clean container, it's the appropriate size so that it will hold the mature size of that vegetable, and it has at least one drainage hole, one good drainage hole, you're golden. So it could be some old 5-gallon buckets. It could be a flour tin. It could be bags. There's a lot of grow bags that we could use for this as well. Or it could be more expensive containers if you want to have those, or a window box. There's lots of options that really work well for vegetables, as long as you consider the fact that how big that's going to get, that vegetable will get, so that it has plenty of room for root growth, for water and nutrients. Next slide. How big should the container be? This is the trick question with vegetable gardening in containers, and there is a publication from Iowa State University called Container Vegetable Gardening that does contain some of this information that gives you an idea of the minimum size for containers for different vegetables. And as you might expect, the smaller the vegetable, the smaller the container can be. So I love growing lettuce in window box containers because they don't have usually massive root systems. And if it's leafy lettuce, it's easy to kind of harvest those from a deck or a balcony. But if I'm growing a tomato, even a determinate tomato or a patio type tomato, I'm still thinking at least a 5-gallon bucket. So the size of that container really helps you determine the size of the root ball and the soil and the water capacity. So you want to stick it to those minimums or a little bit larger, because a larger container holds more water, which means you're watering less. Next slide. There are self-watering containers that you should consider, and some vegetables really respond well to this. They're created primarily for houseplants, but what has happened with these self-watering containers is you have the soil volume in one place, then there's usually some sort of separation in a water reservoir below, and somehow that water is whipped from the reservoir into the soil container. These are fantastic. There's earth boxes that work really well for tomatoes, and they really extend the time between you having to water. And then when you water the reservoir, and it slowly seeps in to the places that it needs to be. This doesn't mean you don't occasionally have to water the top, or doesn't mean that you never have to check the water. You can go away for 2 weeks. You do need to kind of frequently check, but these are great solutions to limit or reduce some of your maintenance. Next slide. And you don't have to spend a lot of money on creating something like this. Once you get the concept that there's a soil volume in one place and it's separated from the water reservoir in another place, and there's some sort of wick that draws it up, you can turn a 2-liter pop bottle into a self-watering container. Next slide. Or anything. So container size is important, and you can recycle a lot of things, even to grow vegetables in. This slide, I'm a little bit torn. I like the look, but you have to be really careful with going with containers that are too small. Vegetables need that full sun. They almost need daily irrigation, especially in a situation like this up against a fairly hot wall. And so you have to find the small enough plants to put in these, maybe some herbs, maybe some leafy greens, and then you have to babysit them to make sure that you're there to make sure they get regular water as well. Otherwise, they're not going to perform well for you. Next slide. After you've thought about your site selection, your container selection, what you're going to grow in, then you have to think about the plant selection. And we'll talk about a number of different plants that you can grow in containers, in part of the vegetable garden in containers. But almost always, when we're thinking about vegetables in containers, I want you to look for more compact or bush or patio types of cultivars. Lettuce is easy because it always stays fairly small, but when you move to something that everyone loves, like tomatoes, we really want to make sure that it's not excessive top growth that may fall over or that may require a little too much maintenance, too much water to maintain it. Almost all vegetable cultivars do have patio, bush, or space-saving cultivars that work really well in containers. It just requires a little more research on your part. Next slide. So before I talk about the vegetables I like to grow in containers, I'm going to ask you which vegetables you like to grow in containers or want to grow in containers, because I bet there's a few that are really important to you. So I'm going to give you about a minute, maybe 2 minutes, to type something into the chat or the comments so that we can read to see what you want to grow in containers. And now's a great time to be thinking about this because we're all getting ready to garden. And thank you for putting in some information on a few links. We're getting a few comments in. Everyone likes peppers. Peas. Cucumbers. Tomatoes. Everyone loves tomatoes in containers. Potatoes in grow bags. Great job. Jane, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I've got herbs as well. Squash. Squash is probably one of the harder things to grow in containers. Really important to find those compact types, because zucchini can be a nightmare otherwise. Oh, good. Good. It's worked for others. So another 30 seconds if you want to type in some things that you want to grow in containers. I think many of these we'll talk about. But last call for anyone that wants to add in. Peanuts. Great idea. Peanuts work really well in containers. Peanuts are a long crop, so you have to start that one pretty soon, believe it or not. And that's a good one in containers. I like it. Okay, I think, Caitlin, we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. Here's my top 10 vegetables to grow in containers. And it's many things that you've already mentioned as well. Tomatoes, potatoes, all different types of greens, lettuce, spinach, kale, any of those work well. Root crops like beets, carrots, and radish are fantastic in containers. And then, of course, the things we can't live without: peppers, eggplants, peas or beans, cucumbers, and then I'm going to add a couple of others that are slightly on the edge to this list as well. You'll also notice in this picture, here's a nice window box with different types of microgreens in containers that they're growing fairly densely in a window box on a patio that can be added to salads. A wasp just visited me. Next slide. So tomatoes. Let's start with tomatoes. This is probably the most popular thing to grow in the vegetable garden and probably one of the most popular vegetables to grow in containers. It also can be one of the trickiest. Tomatoes can get huge. So indeterminate tomatoes would require a really large container to do well. So usually we think of patio type containers as well as patio types of tomatoes and determinate cultivars of tomatoes. So think about Roma type tomatoes. There are plenty of determinate types of cherry tomatoes or grape tomatoes that work incredibly well. There are some super small tomatoes that will actually work in just a normal 6-inch or 1-gallon container as well. So they stay super tiny. And behind me, other side, you'll see tomatoes in hanging baskets. So we planted a few tomatoes in hanging baskets with some of those cherry type tomatoes so that they can kind of grow over and down instead of trying to grow up. If you're not growing them in a hanging basket and allowing them to hang, they probably will need to be staked, even if they're a determinate type, just because of the weight of the fruit as much as anything else. And then, of course, watering regularly is really important with container tomatoes because blossom end rot is a big issue. And that's usually caused by those fluctuations in water, too wet, too dry, too wet, too dry. So watering to kind of to make it consistent or regular moisture helps prevent blossom end rot on those first set of fruit that you want to harvest. Next slide. Potatoes are also easy to grow in containers. I prefer to grow potatoes in like soil bags or containers that I can tip over. I think it makes it really easy to grow them. If you're thinking about a soil bag, pick something sturdy. It's not just a plastic trash bag that's would be ideal. Think of a sturdier bag. These are sometimes called grow bags. And then you can fill them up kind of halfway, put your potato seed pieces in them, fill them up more as they continue to grow, and then you continue to water and maintain them throughout the growing season. Once those tops start to yellow or die, then you just tip over the whole container, the soil bag, and then it's like mining for gold. You're looking for those potato pieces, I guess, in the bag. I think it's easier to actually grow potatoes this way than it is to grow them almost any other way, and usually very, very productive. Next slide. I like leafy greens in containers too. You saw the microgreen slide or picture earlier. I also like lettuce, kale, spinach, and Swiss chard. These are beautiful in containers. I think they're very ornamental, so they work well around the patio with other annual flowers that you might have in containers. The other reason I like greens in containers is I usually can get multiple sowings because most of these are cool season crops. I can plant them or sow them once in April, harvest and sow again, and maybe even again. So you can get multiple sowings of lettuce and spinach. Kale and Swiss chard usually last a little bit longer, but they may wane a little bit in the heat and then you can sow again. It's fun to have that multiple sowings and multiple harvests, even in the same container during that 1 year. Next slide. There are lots of root crops like beets, carrots, radish, and onions that you can grow really well in containers. Usually I would say that these thinning and spacing become really important. I think it's easier to germinate beets and carrots in containers or raised beds because you can kind of keep it evenly moist and they have a better germination success rate. But thinning is super important. Because if you want to harvest a root crop, you've got to give it plenty of space to develop to full size. Most of these are fairly short cycle. So once again, cool season crops that you can sow in April and maybe even sow again in the fall for a fall crop. The other advantage to sowing some of these thickly and then thinning them is with onions. When you're thinning them, then you can use those leafy greens of the onions as green onions, so they don't have to go to waste. So next slide. Peppers are really popular in containers, and that's because peppers are pretty in containers. So they become another ornamental vegetable as well as a wonderful edible as well. So think of sweet bell peppers, banana peppers, hot peppers, and even ornamental peppers are usually edible as well. Consider what kind of pepper you want to grow. Don't grow the hot peppers if you're not going to eat hot peppers. But there's lots of different sizes and colors of peppers. All peppers can be harvested in mature when they're green, or you can wait usually another couple of weeks to 4 weeks and harvest them when they are mature and they usually turn a color. These colors are red, purple, orange, yellow. It's pretty fun to watch. And sometimes they become a lot sweeter when they mature to that color. Peppers as a whole generally aren't very large plants, which is why they are ideal for containers. And they typically like it a little warmer. They like it a little drier, which is ideal for my container culture in my garden. Next slide. Eggplant also works pretty well in containers. I always have problems with flea beetle and eggplant, so having them in containers every few years seems to have less issues with flea beetle, so they become a little harder to find. You have the standard cultivars. You also have some of the Asian cultivars that have slightly smaller eggplant or curved eggplant, which sometimes I think actually works a little bit better in a container, just because of the smaller size. Either way, once again, this one likes it a little on the hot, a little on the dry side, which makes it ideal for container culture. Next slide. Peas and beans also work really well. I would say with peas, we usually do an April sowing and then usually put these in containers where you're going to have it next to a fence or you have a trellis of some sort of support in the container itself. Peas tend to be more of a vining crop, so they need that additional support to work well. Bush beans could also be considered, and they don't usually require a trellis. So they're equally as good in smaller containers as well. And I love having the different colored beans so that you're there, have plenty of them so that you're constantly harvesting them off your patio or your deck. Super easy to grow. Next slide. Cucumbers are a lot like those peas. This is typically a vining crop. There are more compact cultivars of this cucumbers that still produce a number of really nice cucumbers, but they will need some sort of trellis or support. So you can put this up against a balcony edge, so the railing could be part of the support. You could put a kind of trellis in the container itself. All of those will work well. And if you've had problems with vine wilt or sudden death of your cucumbers in the vegetable garden, this might be a great alternative for a year or two until that soil-borne pathogen is no longer there. Next slide. And then my last two are not technically vegetables, but I almost always have them in containers with my vegetables because they do a lot of things in helping with the vegetable crop production. So the first is herbs. I always have some herbs in containers. I love basil in containers. I insist on having mint in containers because it goes everywhere otherwise. Cilantro and parsley are almost always in containers as well. I even have a strawberry pot where I have one herb in the top, and then the 3 or 4 places along the side, I'll have a thyme, parsley, chives, some other kind of herbs so that I can have this herb strawberry pot, a mixed herb container. So that I can harvest those fresh herbs when I'm harvesting my vegetables, which kind of gives everything, makes everything taste a little bit better. Next slide. And then the final thing I will say that you should have in containers with your vegetable garden in containers are a few flowers. Most vegetables will require pollinators. They need to bring in the bees, the wasps, the other things. So in doing that, the flowers are your pollinator attractors. So nasturtiums or marigolds or zinnias, whatever you want to grow, petunias, a few of those in containers near your vegetable containers is a great idea to increase cross-pollination, pollination, and fruit set in many of your vegetable production or plants. Next slide. If you're maintaining vegetables in containers, I will tell you that you're going to water more often. Ideally, if you can water early in the morning, things usually will last most of the day. Many vegetables in containers may require staking or supporting. You can make that look really attractive, or it could just be something really functional up against a balcony or deck or a wall. Most vegetables do insist on some fertilization, so fertilizing them at planting with a kind of a soil fertilizer mix, and then maybe fertilizing again for those longer season crops like tomatoes and peppers might be important. So take a look at the plants and consider some regular fertilizer throughout the growing season. I still mulch my containers, so I make sure that after things are planted, I have a little layer of organic mulch on top to help conserve moisture and prevent weeds. And we don't think about weeds in containers, but it happens, and it happens a lot. So it's a great idea to kind of keep that weed competition down, as well as helping conserve moisture. And then we should also think about protecting vegetables in containers from birds and rabbits and wind, because all of these will happen on any patio or deck. Maybe on a third-story patio, you won't have problems with rabbits, but I guarantee you'll have problems with birds. So thinking about how to protect those plants, at least initially, even from wildlife, is important. Next slide. And then harvesting. If this is your first time growing vegetables in containers, look at the plant label or the seed packet that you're using so that you know what the days to maturity are. This is a guide. It's not going to be exact because it depends on the weather, but this is a great guide in telling you about when you could expect to harvest. If you're harvesting, generally, just like in the vegetable garden, if you can harvest early to mid-morning, and then process or refrigerate or whatever you're going to do with that vegetable as soon as possible. Usually I don't refrigerate cucumbers or tomatoes, but almost everything else goes into the refrigerator and have a little bit longer shelf life that way. And there are plenty of other people. They can tell you all about the different ways to process some of these excessive amounts of vegetables that you can get, even from vegetables in containers. So they can tell you more about freezing, canning, even drying different vegetables so that you can use them later. Next slide. Some of the top mistakes that I see with growing vegetables in containers is a lot of gardeners don't want to have drainage holes in their containers, so they think having a layer of pebbles or pea gravel or marbles in the bottom, that will suffice. You have to be a really good gardener to make that work and work well, because it ends up being a water reservoir that it sometimes stays too wet and sometimes stays too dry. A self-watering container might be a better option there instead. Anytime you get root rot, if it's staying too wet, the first thing that's going to happen is the whole top part of your plant is going to die, and you've only got one shot at some of these vegetables, and that's not what you want if you're counting on those tomatoes. I also invest in some pretty good soil. So I might have 50% compost from the garden, but the other 50% I'm actually going to use a potting mix so that it stays well drained. It has the organic matter that I want, and maybe even has a bit of that starter fertilizer. So start with something good. And then don't put vegetables in the shade. There are some that will tolerate more shade than others, but they do need quite a bit of sun. Some of your leafy greens, you can put them in the shade of some other vegetables on your patio, and they'll work out well. But most of the time, best production is when it's in a sunny site. And then think about that container size again. If it's too small, you're watering too much. If it's too large, it has a tendency to rot and die, especially early on. So you really have to find the right fit for the plant that you're trying to grow. Next slide. So with that, I'm right at 36 minutes or 30 minutes in. What questions do you have about growing plants, growing vegetables in containers?
We'll go ahead and let people take just a minute to get that stuff going. While they're writing in their questions, I would just want to remind everyone that I tossed in a couple different links in the chat for you. Cindy had referenced the container gardening guide. So I went ahead and added that in the comments for you. And then talked a little bit about planting and harvesting times. So I also added in our guide for that as well. So make sure to check those out. Lots of good information in there. The planting and harvesting one is one that I have printed and laminated in the office because I use it all the time.
And I like that one too, because it will tell you multiple plantings of certain things. So you've got those cool season crops. It'll tell you that you can sow or plant it in the spring and then again in the fall. So it's a really nice kind of sliding scale. Very easy and a fun one. I agree.
Yeah. So we'll wait here for just another minute. While we do that, I also did put in the evaluation for today's session into the chat box. I'm also going to show you where you can find that on the website. So really quick, I'm just kind of switching things around on my screen. That's why I'm not quite looking at you guys down here. So let me share that for you.
Okay.
All right. So if you are watching on our website, feel free to jump over to the speakers tab. And if you go down to Cindy's session here and click on that, you'll find the evaluation link. So if you don't have access to any of the comments, feel free to jump over to the speakers page and jump to her description. You'll be able to find it there.
And maybe there are no questions. Maybe we've answered all of their questions, and that's okay too. Here it's a nice place, and maybe they're just dying to get outside.
Yeah, it looks like we don't have a lot of questions today, but I really encourage everyone to try out container gardening. We did just last year do our first container gardening out in our teaching garden. So we had about, I think, 8 different containers. So it was great.
What did well?
Our peppers did really well. Tomatoes. I did suffer a little bit with the cracking of the tomatoes with the watering, but with the first time out there, it's just a process that I have to get used to. So
this is true.
Yeah.
So I have one question on fertilizer and what fertilizer I use. I usually start with a starter fertilizer in the soil mix, so I don't have to worry the first month or so. But then I usually use a water-soluble fertilizer when I'm watering my containers for the longer season crops like tomatoes or peppers. So, but it really is up to you. If you have a preference, you want to use fish emulsion, you can. If you want to use spikes on some of these, you can do that as well. It all seems to work really well. It's just important that it be there for the longer season crops.
Awesome. So if folks end up watching this video later, make sure you can still check out that evaluation link and you can ask some questions in there and I can get those over to Cindy. And so thank you so much, Cindy, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And just a reminder, for everyone, go ahead and join us for our next couple sessions. And so we'll see you guys next week.